For nearly 5 decades after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Texas was one of several states covered by what's known as preclearance.
Preclearance is a very powerful piece of legislation that said that states like Texas and other states that have histories of racial discrimination basically have to get the permission of the federal government before any changes can be made to election laws.
The idea was that with preclearance in place, there were safeguards against lawmakers drawing maps that would suppress or disenfranchise Hispanics and black voters across the state. But it didn't stop lawmakers from trying. In fact, Texas has not made it through a single decade since preclearance has been required without a federal court ruling saying it violated federal laws.
The legal battle over the 2011 maps lasted nearly to the end of the last decade. While that battle played out, Texas needed interim legislative and congressional maps. A federal court in San Antonio drew up the interim maps for the 2012 elections, and a year later, the state legislature made those maps permanent. But there were challenges for years along the way.
Civil rights experts say one of the reasons lawmakers were racially gerrymandering was to dilute the impact of the booming Latino population in Texas.
Since Texas started redistricting every 10 years in the 1970s, in every single round, the courts or the Justice Department have found that Texas discriminated against Latino voters. That's primarily because in Texas, Latino voters have been a growing population, and Texas has had some hesitancy about creating districts to reflect that growth fairly. But it could also be another racial group that experiences discrimination in redistricting, like African Americans or Asian Americans, which we had examples of discrimination there in the last redistricting round, as well as Latinos.
This year, the landscape of Texas redistricting is expected to shift dramatically because of a landmark decision in 2013 by the U.S. Supreme Court to strike down preclearance.
When you had preclearance, the maps had to first be at least given a look at by the folks at the Justice Department, and whether it was a Democratic administration in Washington or a Republican administration in Washington.
And 6 years after preclearance was struck down, Texas voting rights groups were dealt another blow. The Supreme Court ruled in 2019 that federal courts were powerless to hear challenges to partisan gerrymandering.
And so for Democrats or anyone who's looking out for minority populations because of gerrymandering, they're going to have to argue in federal court that those maps are racially discriminatory, which can be a difficult thing to prove.
With that decision and no preclearance protection for the first time since 1965, Texas is entering uncharted territory. It's concerning for people fighting voter suppression, and those who are keeping an eye on things say it's setting the stage for another drawn-out battle in the courts.
To not have those protections on the front end means that those Democrats in the legislature and those representing minority communities in the legislature, which of course would be disproportionately would be Democrats, they have to do their due diligence on the front end in the legislative process, and they can't depend on Washington anymore on the front end of this.